Direct from our newsroom in New York, in color, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Eric Severide in Washington, Steve Rowan in Washington, David Dick in New York, Richard O'Brien in Chicago, Bruce Morton in El Paso, Texas, Bob Evans in Atlanta, Georgia, and Don Webster in Jolin, South Vietnam.
Good evening. President-elect Richard Nixon was briefed today by former Pennsylvania Governor William Scranton on his just completed fact-finding mission to 6 Middle East countries. The meeting may have rekindled the controversy stirred up over Scranton's recent statement that U.S. policy in the area should be even-handed. David Dick reports from New York.
Former Governor Scranton met with the President-elect in his 39th floor offices of the Hotel Pierre, along with Secretary of State-designate William Rogers and Foreign Policy Assistant Henry Kissinger. Apparently, they agreed not to disagree, at least not publicly. Later, Scranton summed up his feelings about the Middle East for reporters.
I made the statement, as you know, as I crossed the Allenby Bridge, that I thought America would do well to have a more even-handed policy in that area. And I would like to explain what I meant by that. Unless you've been there or are there, it is hard to realize how the posture of the United States in that area, the feeling of everyone that you talk to, is that the United States is interested only in one thing, which is the state of Israel and its security. We are interested, very interested in Israel and its security, and we should be. But I think it's important to point out to the Middle East and to people around the world that we're also interested in other countries in the area and that we have friends among them. For if we do not, and if we allow those friends to disappear from our group of friends around the world, the remarkable effect of the Soviet Union in that area in the last few years, the last 2 years particularly, would be even more effective. And secondly, in the Arab world, which is more than 100 million people, I think it is important for us to have friends also.
Governor, is it your impression that, or your feeling rather, that the Arab world is totally committed to the eradication of the state of Israel?
No, I don't think the Arab world is totally, your word was totally, committed to this. There are a lot of Arabs who would like to see the eradication of Israel, and we all know that. There are some, however, who are more moderate in their viewpoint and who believe that they can live with a non-expansionist Israel.
Israeli General Moshe Dayan, the hero of the last Middle East war, stopped by for a visit with President-elect Nixon at his office here at the Hotel Pierre tomorrow morning. One subject is bound to come up: Governor Scranton's proposed even-handed policy in the Middle East. David Dick, CBS News at Nixon headquarters in New York.
Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban, visiting in London, said today that he sees no immediate danger of a new Middle East war. He also expressed hope that the Arabs eventually will agree to engage in direct peace talks with Israel. But Egypt said again today that the Nasser regime will not negotiate with Israel, and it called on the United Nations to apply more pressure on Israel to give up conquered Arab territory.
That stock will double by Monday. That's the 28th. Right. Yeah.
He's wearing the calendar watch band, the date finder.
Right.
A new idea from Spidell.
Well, that's 4 weeks from
The date finder gives you a whole year built into a handsome Spidell Twistoflex watch band.
Uh-huh. No. The 26th isn't a Thursday. It's a Wednesday. What's the matter? Haven't you got a calendar handy? Yeah, we'll keep in touch.
Roll the calendar back and forth to any month you want to check.
Hi. Hey, I thought I told you never to call me at the office.
Now you can tell all the time, all of the time, anywhere.
From British Sterling, new bitter lemon. An utterly new cool.
New bitter lemon aftershave and cologne. A fresh, enduring cool that goes beyond lime. New bitter lemon. So fine a gift, it's even sold in jewelry stores.
Representative Melvin Laird, who will be the next Defense Secretary, went to Walter Reed Army Medical Center today to get former President Eisenhower's views on coordinating the Defense Department. He also met with Defense Secretary Clark Clifford. Laird then held a news conference, and CBS News correspondent Steve Rowan reports.
Secretary-designate Laird sidestepped questions about future defense policy, but with some of his answers, he indicated ending the war in Vietnam comes first. For example, he was asked whether he'll give Congress more realistic budget figures than the estimates that he often criticized as a congressman.
I hope so, but I would first hope that by the time that we get to the preparation of our first budget, we could end the war in Vietnam.
Laird also indicated he favors a strong military posture and nuclear superiority, as does the man he would have preferred Richard Nixon to name to the post of Defense Secretary.
Well, I favored the appointment of a Democrat as Secretary of Defense, but and so recommended to President-elect Nixon. As a matter of fact, I made a strong case for 3 weeks, and I thought that I had arrived at the point where we would have a Democrat as Secretary of Defense, but it did not work out that way. Well, I don't mind telling you that I supported and recommended to the President-elect, Senator Jackson of Washington, for this job.
Would you care to tell us who you would like to bequeath your policy post to the Republican conference to, if you could?
Oh, I think I'd better stay away from that fight.
The next Secretary of the Treasury, David Kennedy, also had a news conference today, and CBS Newsman Richard O'Brien reports from Chicago.
The newly named Treasury Secretary says he believes in balanced budgets, but also declared there is in his mind such a thing as an acceptable deficit. Kennedy also was asked if the war in Vietnam were to end soon, would we be able to make a firm economic commitment to the nation's ghettos?
I don't feel that just a major dollar commitment is what the ghettos need. The ghettos need education, training. They need cultural advantages. They need many, many things. But just to make an X billion-dollar appropriation will not accomplish. We've appropriated lots of billions of dollars in that field, and some good has come. But what we've got to do is get a program that's designed to bring up their hopes and aspirations and then follow through.
Kennedy was asked to comment on published reports calling him a fiscal conservative.
I don't know what's meant anymore by the word conservative or the word liberal. Really. I believe in having our finances of the United States in such order that we can have economic growth that's sustainable without inflationary pressures that will cause us serious damage as we've had in the last year, or with the turn back. Now, if that's conservative, I'm conservative.
Incoming Labor Secretary George Shultz said today that in general he opposes federal intervention in labor disputes, but does favor a careful study of the reasons for strikes by teachers and other public employees. Shultz, who is dean of the Chicago Graduate School of Business, made the remarks after meeting with outgoing Labor Secretary Willard Wirtz in Washington.
To a tinker, it's a long field goal. To an actress, it's a starring role. To a rower, it's encouragement. To a smoker, it's a Kent. The taste of Kent. The taste of Kent. The taste of Kent. More taste, fine tobacco. To a yodeler, it's a yodeler. To an expert, it's a special cue. To a father, it's a big event. To a smoker, it's a Kent. The taste of Kent. The taste of Kent. The taste of Kent. More taste, fine tobacco.
If you smoke a filter cigarette, try the taste of Kent.
President Johnson was in El Paso, Texas today, where he took part in a unique ceremony. CBS News correspondent Bruce Morton reports.
Heads of state's formal duties are usually dull. Treaty signings, formal dinners, but occasionally something zippier comes along, like a chance to change a river's course. The Chamizal is a disputed piece of land between Mexico and the United States. Mexico lost it 100 years ago when the Rio Grande, the boundary, changed its course. The Mexicans complained. Presidents Lyndon Johnson and Gustavo Díaz Ordaz signed a treaty last year with Mexico getting back some 400 acres. Today, they changed the river's course to make it the boundary once again.
Peace is the free commerce of men and ideas and goods across borders. The finest thing I know to say about both countries and both presidents and both people is that as we sit here today, we have no armies patrolling our borders. We have confidence in each other, and we have peace with one another.
After speeches, the two men walked over to press the buttons that would detonate a retaining wall about a mile away and send the water down its new channel. The explosion was fine. But as the cheering subsided, people began wondering where the water was. Finally, the trickle came. The Rio Grande has always been a muddy river. This effort at international neatness, matching river with border, cost the United States $39 million. But the river now flows in a concrete channel, ending the chances of it straying again and provoking a new 100-year argument. The dispute over this fairly scruffy piece of land lasted a long time, but as both presidents pointed out, it ended happily. No one went to war for it, and the language on both sides was polite. Bruce Morton, CBS News, El Paso, Texas.
Vice President Humphrey said today that he was honored by an offer of a joint faculty position by the University of Minnesota and nearby McAllister College, and he would give the invitation serious consideration. The job would pay $30,000 for 9 months' work. Humphrey graduated from Minnesota and once taught at McAllister. Federal health officials reported today that flu and pneumonia deaths now are running more than 40% above normal nationwide, and that increasing absenteeism in some areas has closed or seriously affected many schools, businesses, and industries. Post office officials, worried about the flu spreading among postal workers, urged that Christmas cards and packages be put in the mail as soon as possible. We get a report on the flu from CBS News correspondent Bob Evans at the National Communicable Disease Center in Atlanta.
This specimen of flu virus isolated in this test tube vial was taken from a throat specimen within the last 3 days. It's in the process of being identified as a type of the Hong Kong flu virus infecting many parts of the United States and being worked on here in this influenza laboratory of the National Communicable Disease Center in Atlanta.
We asked the head of the lab, Dr. Marion Coleman, when vaccine supply would catch up with demand.
The demand for the vaccine is not necessarily the group who most need the vaccine. These people are those over 65 and persons chronically ill who would suffer dire effects or death in the event they should become infected with influenza. One of the real problems with vaccine distribution is seeing that those persons, the high-risk persons, are the ones who do receive that which is available.
The Deputy Director of the Communicable Disease Center, Dr. John Bagby.
What about the symptoms? How could a person recognize if he's beginning to come down with the Hong Kong flu bug?
Unfortunately, those symptoms are so much like any others that I'm not sure he could recognize them and say he has the flu. Now, he'll start with a fever and a headache and aching muscles. This is true of a lot of respiratory infections, of course. The only definitive diagnosis of flu is by laboratory test.
The latest reports are that 31 states, New York City, and the District of Columbia all report some kind of flu activity. And the prospect is that that will rise to higher numbers, reaching a climax of the epidemic in the middle of January. Bob Evans, CBS News, Atlanta.
The Federal Communications Commission today announced that it would authorize pay television in the nation's larger cities. It said that it would license pay TV stations in cities that now have at least 4 free TV stations, and that the earliest starting date would be next June the 12th to permit time for congressional and court action. In addition, the FCC also proposed new rules governing operations of cable television systems known as CATV. Among the rules, the CATV systems would have to originate some of their own programs. However, they also would be allowed to retransmit programs picked up from distant stations if the originating stations approved. Prices closed higher on the New York Stock Exchange today. Volume was 16 3/4 million shares, and the exchange index gained 16 cents.
Behold the jogger. In any weather, he jogs on, as though he'd never heard of colds or flu. That's why we've gone out of our way to remind him, when you catch a cold or flu, do what doctors say to do. Rest in bed, drink plenty of fluids, and take aspirin to relieve the pains and reduce the fever. Bayer is pure aspirin, not just part aspirin. And aspirin is what doctors recommend. Bayer works wonders. When you have acid indigestion, every second counts. So count on instant-acting Phillips tablets. Phillips tablets go to work in seconds. With one of the fastest stomach settlers ever discovered, each small Phillips tablet neutralizes more excess stomach acid than the leading antacid tablet that comes in a roll. So for fast relief from acid-upset stomach, when every second counts, count on instant-acting Phillips tablets.
In Paris, U.S. and North Vietnamese negotiators failed in another attempt to agree on a seating plan for the expanded negotiations. The Allies have rejected a four-sided table because that would indicate a separate status for the Viet Cong. The Communists, in turn, have rejected a rectangular table because that would indicate only two-sided talks. The Allies today reportedly suggested that the four parties sit at two semicircular tables, or at a round table cut in two. The North Vietnamese rejected that idea, at least tentatively. French journalists have been having a field day poking fun at this table issue. Paris Humor magazine suggested, for example, this not maze-like a conference table. Not only would it permit all four parties to be seated, also would enable them to turn their backs on one another, the French paper pointed out. In Vietnam, B-52 bombers carrying out their heaviest strikes in 2 months have dropped 3,000 tons of explosives on enemy base camps and infiltration routes near the Cambodian border. In Saigon itself, the government kept its troops on full alert, claiming the Viet Cong might launch a major attack at any time. But American field officers, whose men are on the same status, said they have seen little sign of enemy activity in the Saigon area. And our CBS News Bureau in Saigon quotes South Vietnamese sources as saying that if the alert has no military justification, it could be politically inspired for the benefit of the Saigon delegation in Paris. According to these sources, the Saigon government's aim would be to convince world public opinion that its forces are so strong that the enemy fears to try another offensive. The heaviest recent ground action took place on the edge of the demilitarized zone earlier this week, when U.S. Marines lost 12 dead and 30 wounded in a battle with North Vietnamese. We have a report on the military situation in that area from CBS News correspondent Don Webster.
Spotting enemy troops inside the demilitarized zone is now a daily occurrence. President Johnson's warning that we would halt the bombing of North Vietnam only if the communists respect the DMZ seems to have made no difference at all. At this outpost of Gio Linh, towards the eastern end, a year and a half of heavy shelling has almost leveled the DMZ.
Secondaries of black smoke. 2 bunkers destroyed and 1 damaged.
The DMZ extends for about 5 miles on each side of the Ben Hai River. In charge of the Gio Linh combat base is First Lieutenant John Williamson.
What changes do the communists seem to have made in their tactics here since the bombing halt?
Well, they're much more obvious. They have no fear whatsoever now of marching down in their groups, 3, 4, 5 people walking along the river. They know we can see them, but they know we can't do anything about it, and they just seem to flaunt this at us.
Do you observe much infiltration into South Vietnam through the DMZ?
Just in small groups. As I say, we haven't observed anything at all that is large in nature. Most of the things seem to be these 5, 6-man groups that come down. They'll walk across and then we'll chase them back.
Gio Linh and its western neighbor, Con Thien, are relatively familiar names because of the heavy shelling last year. But things are relatively quiet there now. Neither base has been shelled since November 9th. The real crisis at the DMZ is not at the eastern end, but rather here in the rugged peaks of the western half. Here, a string of remote mountaintop bases line the DMZ. The binoculars used here can see only as far as the nearest clump of trees. The troops at these outposts are trying to stop infiltration in an area of about 500 square miles. Commanding officer of the units along the entire DMZ is Major General Raymond Davis.
Ambassador Harriman has said there can be no serious military negotiations in Paris until the North Vietnamese have withdrawn from the DMZ. Have they withdrawn?
I think a fair answer to that would be that not necessarily. Some months ago, they had an active division in and above the DMZ. It came south in August, September, and early October. Pretty thoroughly defeated, it went away. Not of its own accord. It also has 3 regiments, more or less security screening regiments, operating in, above, and below the DMZ. I believe they're still there. Evidence is clear to me that they are using the DMZ. Those 3 regiments are to the same degree they did before.
Has the caliber of the communist troops operating in the DMZ changed any in the last few months?
Well, overall, the caliber of the Red soldiers has changed dramatically. He, as late as May, performed very effectively, professionally. Since that time, I'm convinced that we have almost totally destroyed his experienced NCOs, his junior officers, to such a degree that our latest skirmishes with him clearly indicated a lack of a trained professional corps.
Although the bases may be relatively remote, each is placed within artillery range of its neighbors. At this moment, a nearby base is under communist mortar attack, and this outpost is firing its artillery at a spot they believe the mortars are coming from.
Until now, it's been the bases in the eastern half of the demilitarized zone that have gotten most of the publicity. But the next big hotspot may be one of these remote fire bases in the western half. Don Webster, CBS News, at a fire base on the demilitarized zone.
Czechoslovakia's labor unions warned today they will call a general strike if Soviet occupation officials try to remove Prague's reform leadership. The unions, through their newspaper, expressed particular concern about Josef Smirkovsky, a one-time factory worker who now is president of the National Assembly. A progressive, he has been snubbed by the Soviets on recent occasions, and there are reports that he may be one of the victims in a possible government reshuffle. 9 members of a self-proclaimed Cuban power group were sentenced to prison today in Miami for conspiring to attack foreign ships trading with Castro. Dr. Orlando Bosch, a former Havana pediatrician who headed the group, was sentenced to 10 years and the others to lesser terms. Bosch and 2 of the others last September had shelled, with no damage, a Polish freighter docked in Miami. The judge called the plot stupid and said the group hardly was fighting communism by its action. He said it appealed Bosch was trying to gain personal power and, quote, perhaps collect money from other Cubans through his exile activities. Hope was abandoned late today for finding any survivors from that Pan American jetliner which exploded and crashed last night off the Venezuelan coast while on a flight from New York to Caracas. The plane, a Boeing 707, was believed to have carried at least 19 Americans among the 42 passengers and crew of 9. Investigations underway, and one Venezuelan official speculated that the plane might have been sabotaged. Space officials at Cape Kennedy decided today to start the countdown for next week's Apollo 8 moon mission this Sunday, one day earlier than planned. Spokesman said that since the Apollo systems check was finished 3 days ahead of schedule, they'd like to begin the countdown sooner so as to have extra time to work on any problems that might come up. The launch date remains the same, 1 week from tomorrow.
Before this year's pro football season could begin, it took weeks of practice and many thousands of hours on our nationwide telephone network.
Take the annual draft, with general managers talking to personnel directors, coaches, and players, with tons of teletype-written information switching back and forth. The pros ran up over 25,000 hours of telephone network time. And our network will be even more helpful in years to come. General managers will be tapping on touch-tone phones, getting vital statistics directly from computers at Central Scouting Headquarters. They'll be running through films of players switched from their scouting centers over our network with picture phone service. Just about anything goes instantly on our network, anywhere, anytime.
Your anywhere, anything, anytime network. AT&T.
San Francisco State College closed for the Christmas holidays today, a week earlier than scheduled. Acting President Hayakawa said he ordered the early shutdown partly because of threatened new trouble on the campus, where there have been demonstrations and violence over the last month. In Washington tonight, Eric Severide takes a look at student unrest and reaction to it. Eric?
Mass protests and massive force applied to centers of learning are a new experience in the American story, and the phenomenon seems to be spreading, not diminishing. This has been discussed here from time to time, the starting point or bias, if you will, being the general premise that violence and education are not only incompatible, but in the end mortal enemies. We have further suggested that for many protesting students, the protest itself is the thing, not the stated aims of the protest. The letters from listeners are numerous, pro and con. Some are passionate in tone, some reasonable and enlightening. Right now, the most persistent, festering embroilment is that at San Francisco State College. At least one letter on this affair is worth passing on. It comes from Mr. John Fell, the chairman of the film department at the college, who writes, we take it more in explanation than in justification, and says this. The dissident groups, Black Students Union and Third World Liberation Front, seem in many eyes, including my own, quite ready to kill for their cause, however frivolous it may seem to the outside world. In their mind, with the romanticism of the new left and the desperation of the city ghetto, there is nothing to lose. They want the opportunity to equip themselves with the resources of the state to confront the realities of their squalid community toward the end of a realistic program of non-assimilated self-improvement. They want to redefine themselves, and they want their way now. They find essential disinterest behind the stalling rationalizations of academic bureaucracy. They have learned the lessons of power seizure, intransigence, and stylized violence. But they are full of the deepest rage, and stylized window breaking will become stylized bombing, and worse if it becomes necessary to step up the campaign. The confrontation of black rage and white guilt, however sloppily it may be coming off, hold the deepest consequences for everyone. End of Mr. Fell's quotation. Walter?
That's the way it is. Friday, December 13th, 1968. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News. Good night.
This has been the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. See the unusual episode of the Wild Wild West tonight in color on CBS.